Okay, this is page 93. Now we want to talk about something called the withdrawal reflex. Now the purpose of a withdrawal reflex, as I wrote, is it's a reflex response to a painful or noxious stimulus applied to an arm or a leg. The purpose of a withdrawal reflex is that whenever you touch something that starts to harm you, to injure you, you have a built-in reflex that withdraws or pulls that injured limb away from the source of injury. So if you reached out to pick up a frying pan and it was hot, you reflexly withdraw your hand from that hot frying pan so you don't continue to burn yourself. You don't have to touch it and say, hey, this is really hot. You reflexly withdraw your hand from that hot object. If you were walking barefoot and you stepped on a piece of glass, you pull your foot off that sharp piece of glass. You don't continue driving that piece of glass deeper into your foot. You withdraw your arm or leg away from the cause of injury. Now, in order to describe this withdrawal reflex, I have to introduce you to two words at the top of the page, ipsilateral and contralateral. Lateral means on the side, right? Medial means towards the midline, lateral means to the sides. Ipsi means same, and contra means opposite. Right? If somebody is contrary, they do the opposite of what you told them to do. So ipsilateral literally means same side, contralateral means opposite side. Now, why did I want to introduce those terms to you? Because a withdrawal reflex really is made up of two parts, two components. It involves a reflex flexion or withdrawal of the injured, the affected limb, and the extension of the opposite or contralateral limb. So when we actually flex or to withdraw one limb, we simultaneously extend the opposite limb to maintain our center of gravity, our balance. To show you this, I've somewhat arbitrarily chosen this example, if you look on the lower left, of walking barefoot and stepping on something sharp. Whether you stepped on a sharp piece of glass or you stepped on a safety pin in this case, or whatever, you're going to reflexly withdraw, which involves flexion, withdrawing that injured limb away from the source of injury, so you don't keep stepping and pushing that pin deeper into your foot. That would be pretty stupid. So, but at the same time, we're going to see that you're going to extend the opposite leg. We'll see how that works. Now, we know that what triggers any reflex is you have to activate a sensory neuron. In the anti-gravity stretch reflexes, they were activated by a stretch sensory neuron, called a stretch receptor. In this case, what activates a withdrawal reflex is activation of a pain sensory neuron, also known as a nociceptor. Nociceptor, and we've given you this name before, is the technical name for a pain sensory neuron. Now, in this example, it shows the pin in the foot. Now, in this picture, is the pin actually sticking into the sensory neuron, the pain sensory neuron? Doesn't look like it. Now, it could. It's certainly possible that the pin could be sticking right into the neuron, but that's not necessary. Because what normally activates a pain sensory neuron are kinins and prostaglandins released from the injured cells. All you have to do is injure cells, they release chemicals, and it's these chemicals that activate this pain sensory neuron. That's why we've learned a pain sensory neuron is a chemoreceptor, responding, being activated by these chemicals. We originally learned this way back when we were talking about chemical mediators of inflammation. Now, once this activates an action potential, let's follow the pain sensory neuron or nociceptor up, 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 up. Here's the cell body of the pain sensory neuron, and it's shown entering the spinal cord. Now, in reality, a sensory neuron is going to synapse onto about 100 neurons, but we didn't draw all 100 because we didn't want this picture too messy. But we do show this pain sensory neuron activating several neurons. One of them that it directly activates is a somatic motor neuron. How do I know that's a somatic motor neuron? Because they originate in the ventral gray horns of the spinal cord. This activates an action potential in the somatic motor neuron. Let's follow it down. And what does this somatic motor neuron activate? It activates what is labeled the ipsilateral flexor muscle. You'd say, what does that mean? Ipsilateral means same side. It activates the flexor muscle, which is this hamstring muscles that flex the lower leg on the same side that was injured. And flexing that leg is going to pull that foot off the floor, so withdrawing it away from the source of injury. But we remember this concept called reciprocal innervation. If we're going to activate the flexor muscle, we must simultaneously make sure that the antagonist muscle, the extensor, is relaxed. Let's see how that's done. So going back up to the spinal cord, here's that pain sensory neuron, and not only is it activating this somatic motor neuron, it is shown activating this interneuron. This interneuron is shaded in black to represent that it releases an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It releases the inhibitory neurotransmitter onto this somatic motor neuron. That inhibits, that hyperpolarizes it. It prevents it from sending any signal to the opposing extensor muscle. So you'll notice that what was happening is we're activating the somatic motor neuron to one muscle that flexes the lower leg and simultaneously inhibiting the somatic motor neuron that controls the antagonist extensor muscle of the leg. You might ask, did you write any of that anywhere? Yes, I did. It's at the bottom of the page. At the bottom of the page, we wrote, how do we get flexion of the affected, the injured limb, that removes the injured limb from the noxious, which means harmful stimulus. The flexor muscle was stimulated to contract, while at the same time the extensor muscle was prevented from contracting. And you do, how do you make one muscle contract? You activate the somatic motor neuron to it. How do you make sure that the other muscle is relaxed? You inhibit the motor neuron to that muscle. Now, this is called reciprocal innervation. But we've still got to explain another part to this reflex. When you, and pull this back here. So, if you're going to flex this leg off the floor, you better make damn sure that the opposite leg is on the floor. Because if you lift this foot off the ground and the other foot was also off the ground at the same time, you're going to fall backwards, break your spine, and this would be a really stupid reflex because it would kill you. And the purpose of homeostatic reflexes is to keep us alive, not to kill us. So this reflex, at the same time that you flex the injured foot away from the source of injury, you simultaneously extend the opposite foot to make sure it holds you up. Brilliant. How does that work? Such high technical production, you know, with this video here. All right, how this works is, let's look back up at the spinal cord here. You'll notice that this pain sensory neuron is also shown synapsing and activating, because sensory neurons always excite, an interneuron that does what? That decussates. It crosses over to the other side of the spinal cord, and it's shown synapsing onto a number of neurons. And one of them that it synapses and excites is a somatic motor neuron right here. Let's follow this somatic motor neuron. It sends an action potential to what muscle? To what is labeled the contralateral extensor muscle. What does that mean? It's the extensor muscle. We're going to activate the extensor muscle on the contralateral, the opposite side. So that's how we activate the quadriceps that extends the leg on the opposite leg. But we still remember this concept of reciprocal innervation. If we're going to activate the extensor muscle of this leg, we must also make sure that the opposing antagonist muscle is relaxed and doesn't prevent extension. So how does that accomplish? Look, this interneuron that decussated not only activated directly this somatic motor neuron to the extensor muscle, but it activated an inhibitory interneuron that released an inhibitory neurotransmitter onto this somatic motor neuron, and this is the somatic motor neuron that controls the contralateral flexor muscle, the hamstring muscles, the biceps femoris. So what are we doing? We're activating the somatic motor neuron to the extensor muscle, and at the same time inhibiting the motor neuron that controls the flexor muscle. That way this leg will for sure extend. You said, did you write that anywhere? Yes, I wrote it on the next page, on page 94 at the top. So how do we get extension of the contralateral limb, which acts to maintain the person's balance and support his weight? The extensor muscle was stimulated to contract, whereas the flexor muscle was prevented from contracting under the concept of reciprocal innervation. Now, in fact, this reflex is even more complicated than what I've described. What I've described is what I'm holding you responsible for, but I want to actually show you what's really going on. Okay, we'll try to show you what's really going on here. In reality, when you flex the injured foot off the floor, right, and extend the opposite foot, the problem is you're going to fall this way because there's too much weight on one leg. So here's what actually happens. You flex the injured foot off the floor, you extend the contralateral, the opposite foot, you extend the ipsilateral arm and flex the contralateral arm to maintain your center of gravity, your center of balance. Do you follow that? So literally, the signals are not only affecting the legs, impulses are going up the spinal cord and activating motor neurons to the arm muscles at the same time. Now we know this happens for many reasons, including they have done high-speed photography where they've had somebody step on something sharp, and this is what they do. And they've also, of course, traced the neural pathways now within the spinal cord. But it's really amazing how we're wired. And this is all part of these built-in reflexes that keep us alive. So just wanted to give you an appreciation of the complexity of these somatic motor reflexes. Okay, so we have spoken of anti-gravity stretch reflexes today, which are built in, and the withdrawal reflex, which is really made up of two components, a flexion of the injured limb and an extension of the opposite limb, commonly known as a crossed extensor. I want to briefly mention the idea that we also have learned or conditioned somatic motor reflexes. Now, when we talk about a learned reflex, that always involves your brain, your cerebral cortex, because that's where learning occurs. Let me give you an example of the most famous learned or conditioned reflex every single one of you knows. You learned it in an introductory psychology course. Do you remember Ivan Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs? So this was the classic example of a learned or conditioned reflex. Everybody hears this in a psych class. So what Pavlov did, who was a Russian psychologist, is he would put food out for his dogs, and he would ring a bell at the same time. The dogs would come to the food. They could smell the food. The food was out. And they always heard this bell ringing. And they learned to associate the ringing of the bell with food time. So they reached a point where he didn't have to put the food out. All he had to do was ring the bell when they would come. He had conditioned them to come where even if he didn't put the food out. That was a learned reflex. So there are all kinds of learned reflexes that we have. So what's an example? The earliest learned reflex is probably potty training. You had to learn that. Your parents had to teach you that, or you'd still be wearing a diaper. How did that work? You know, after you've been changing the diapers for about almost 2 years, it gets pretty old. So here's what happens. By the time the kid reaches about 2 years of age, it's hard to do this much before that, a little bit before, but again, it requires development of the nervous system. So the moment it looks like that kid is starting to do number 1 or number 2, you'll start to see their face. And it looks like they might be doing either number 1 or number 2. You pick them up and rush them and sit them on a potty. You want them, just like Pavlov's dogs, to make the association that this is where you do what you're about to do. So after you keep doing that enough times, the kid starts to figure out, I guess this is where I'm supposed to do number 1 or number 2, is they always put me here. Now, you don't have to be a human to be conditioned or have potty training. Because many of you have a pet, like a dog, and you keep your dog indoors. You have trained your dog. It will stay indoors all day, and it waits until you come home and walk it around the block that it takes care of its duties. Isn't that right? You had to train it. You had to condition it. If you don't train it, then it doesn't learn to do that. So it doesn't require a human brain to do this kind of conditioning, but it does require learning. This would mean that this reflex, if there was any injury to the brain, you might lose these reflexes, because these are wired in the brain, in the cerebral cortex. Now, another reflex that we learned is tying our shoes. I'll demonstrate this. Now, it took me, I think I was 14 years old before I learned how to tie my shoes. Most people, it doesn't take them that long. But, you know, it's kind of complicated to tie your shoes, because, you know, you make these loops and so on, and it's hard to remember whether the shoelace goes through the loop or under the loop. And, you know, many times when you were learning, you would tie it and the whole thing would just fall apart when you let go. And I don't know if kids today even have to learn how to tie shoes because they have Velcro on their shoes. But anyhow, once you learn how to tie a shoelace, it becomes a reflex. A reflex means I don't have to think about it. So I'm going to demonstrate it. Let's see if I actually learned it. So those people in front, and I don't know if the video camera is going to record it. So what I'm going to do, I'm holding my shoelaces. I am not going to look at my fingers at all. I'm actually going to be looking at your faces and talking about, well, we could talk about the weather, and I'm looking around to make eye contact with all of you, and I didn't look at my hands at all, and I think I did tie them. And you can too. It's not just me. Because once you've learned it, you have a built-in program where the brain makes the muscles work reflexly in your fingers because you've done that so many times, they know what to do. And it frees your mind so you can do something else. You could have a conversation with somebody and tie your shoelaces at the same time. And this is the benefit of making some repeated activity become a reflex. So that way you can focus your attention on something else and the reflex takes over that. Now, another example of a learned reflex, most of us have learned, is riding a bicycle. How many times when you were learning to ride a bicycle did it tip over? Or go off the sidewalk onto the street, off the curb? Or you plowed right into a tree? It was hard. You had to learn, you know, when they took those training wheels off, you had to learn how to balance, how to pedal, how to steer, and you also had to remember where the brake pedal was. because sometimes you were pedaling and smiling and you're doing it and your parents are happy and they're saying go, go, and you forgot where the brake pedal was and you crashed into a tree or something. Went right off the side, the curb. All right, but eventually once you've learned, you just get on a bicycle and you ride it and you don't give it a thought at all. Another example is swimming. So you remember when you were learning how to swim? That was hard. You probably thought you were going to drown a couple of times. You had to learn how to tread water. You had to learn how to kick your feet, how to move your arms. But eventually, once you learn how to swim, it becomes a reflex, and you just swim and you don't even think about it. Some people are still trying to learn how to ski. And until you learn, you keep basically tipping over, falling over, crashing into trees. But eventually, once you learn, then you don't think about it anymore. That's true with any learned reflex. More recently, many of us have learned how to drive a car. Sometimes we forget how nervous we were when we were first learning. Right? You had to remember, when do I look at the rear view mirror? Where's the side mirrors? When do I use those? Where's the signal light? Probably when you were learning at one point, you wanted to hit the brake pedal and you hit the accelerator pedal and almost crashed into the car in front of you. You remember that. So you got really nervous. Remember the first time you had to go on the freeway, right? You thought you were going to die. All right, now, once you've been driving for a while, you don't pay any attention whatsoever. It's really amazing. You're driving your car, listening to the music, holding a cell phone, talking to the person behind you, noticing that there's a good sale going on over there. I'll have to go back over there later. All right, in other words, you are not paying any attention to what you're doing because it's all become reflexive. You really pay very little attention to it. That's why if all of a sudden somebody runs out in the street, it's like you're caught by like a shock because it's all built-in reflex. You weren't even paying any attention. An example that I commonly give is sometimes, my wife will ask me on the way home from work, stop off at the market, pick up some milk or something. I don't know how many times I've been asked that. I drive right past the market and go home, and she'll say, "Did you get the milk?" And I'm thinking, oh yeah, I was supposed to do that, wasn't I? I wasn't even there. I was just driving my car. I take a typical route, and then somehow I go from here to home, and I don't even know how I got there. So, and that's pretty typical for most people. So if you have to do anything different from your routine, you really have to concentrate. These are examples of learned or conditioned reflexes. And you will continue to develop these. Somebody who becomes a dental hygienist, you will practice and practice and practice your finger skills to the point where you don't even have to think about it anymore. But it's going to take a lot of practice to create these programs in your brain so your fingers know what to do automatically. It's true if somebody is a gymnast, if they're a dancer, if they learn any new skill, right? You learn to do Zumba, whatever it might be. So you program your brain to activate the muscles automatically. Okay, we have now completed our description of somatic motor reflexes.